Andy nodded in silent agreement, mentally cursing himself for every shake of his head. No doubt what Charles said was nothing but the complete truth. He was, after all, exactly that kind, to work unpaid overtime and see it as the rest of the workforce's duty to do likewise. After all, if he could do it, so could everyone else. "I'm sorry. I made an appointment. May I?" Charles dismissed Andy with an absent flap of his hand, showing clearly upon his face his disappointment that a fellow employee could not be as selfless as he, actually demanding the time off he was due. Other than the initial disappointment shake of his head, Andy saw none of this, turning his back upon Charles and charging out of the door at as fast a pace as he could manage with dignity. At a pace just shy of a jog, Andy moved through the scenarii, ignoring the mostly identical scenery as he passed, frequently ducking to avoid some of the lower ceilings. It took only a few minutes for him to escape the narrow connecting units that made up the majority of the scenarii and enter the vast space of the market. The market was indeed vast and open, though only relative to other areas of the scenarii. A number of assorted stalls filled the large chamber. Bodies moved between them, colliding with one another and exchanging pleasantries, though only occasionally. At the far end of the chamber sat a small restaurant that the more wealthy inhabitants and visitors of the scenarii frequented. Beyond the edge of the stalls, slipping away from the populous market, was a particularly narrow set of corridors that Andy had come to know well. Without looking around, he charged into the muddled mass of people who were moving through the marketplace. A giant of a man wearing thick overalls that stank of asteroid ore, a small waspish woman in a very downplayed gray suit, 3 or 4 children charging through the sparse stretches of open floor, a single woman holding a starving child alone among the group. Apologizing for the occasional collision, Andy charged through the throng, his head down and his features obscured. A cold sweat was breaking out all over his body. Nervously, he raised his right arm, using his rolled-up shirt sleeve to wipe the worst of it from his forehead, until he at last broke out of the throng, facing into the darkened, twisting corridor he had been aiming for. Without hesitation or consideration, Andy stepped forward and into the corridor. His eyes focused ahead of him, his feet leading instinctively to where he had to go. Andy passed through a few more corridors, ignoring the ever-constricting space and growing smell of leaking gas. Walking forward, turning right, then left, then right, he marched on to his destination, finding when he got there not a soul. "You missed me?" Andy pivoted on his heels towards the voice that had spoken from behind him, his heart beating audibly in his ears as he did so. Seeing who it was that spoke, his racing heart immediately began to slow in satisfied relief. Reese wore a simple pair of worn jeans and a long-sleeved black top with no discernible insignia. His face was sharp and narrow, and his widening grin forced deep, devilish dimples into his face. Absently, Reese knocked a strand of his long, muddy blonde hair out from in front of an eye. Andy smiled manically back towards Reese. "Jesus Christ, man, you scared the hell out of me." "Oh, me?" Reese walked towards Andy. That same wide grin spread across his face. "Nice try," Andy groaned, watching Reese as he swaggered forwards. "Have you got some stuff for me?" "Whatever happened to small talk, Andy? You used to be full of it, you know. Besides, aren't you supposed to be working?" "I'm on a break." "Good for you." Andy took an instinctive step forward, cold sweat erupting on his forehead again, his right arm starting to tremble worse than before. He could not abide Reese's games even after all this time, or possibly because of it. Either way, he was in no mood. "For Christ's sake, Reese, stop messing with me. Have you got it or don't you?" My, Reese crooned, smiling mischievously at Andy. "You really are in a hurry today, aren't you?" Against every fiber of his being, Andy forced himself to take one very long, deep breath, ignoring Reese's bait. With no small amount of effort, he forced himself to meet Reese's glare with a straight, unsmiling face. A moment of silence drew out between the pair until Reese finally broke Andy's gaze, acquiescing with a small chuckle. Okay, I got your stuff, Reese said in a voice near a whisper. Here. In Reese's outstretched hand was a cartridge, almost identical to the empty one Andy had placed in his drawer some short time before. Instinctively, Andy grabbed for the cartridge, which was promptly snatched away from him by Reese. Fumbling after the failed grasp, Andy turned to meet Reese's own very cold glare. When Reese spoke, none of the early playful humor remained. Not so fast, Andy. We've not sorted out the logistics. What logistics? Andy snapped before catching himself. You're going to try and fleece me? It's not that simple, I'm afraid. This, Reese opened his closed fist to reveal the cartridge again, is a triple dose. A triple? How the hell did you get that in the outer system? Never mind. And don't ask me that question. Ever. Understand? Andy nodded slowly, recoiling slightly at the anger in Reese's voice. Looking down at his feet, Andy took a moment to compose himself, taking a long, slow breath of air. How much? Now that's more like it. Reese smiled again, though the coldness in his eyes never departed. 17. From behind Reese, a noise sounded like pieces of metal snapping and coming together. The last remnants of his smile faded from his face. Reese turned towards the noise. To Reese's left, just behind a turning in the corridor, a small figure stepped out. In one long, outstretched arm, the figure held a seamless steel tube no wider than a pen. The end of the strange tube faded from seamless steel into a kind of strange glowing sphere that bathed the dim corridors in a strange pulsating scarlet light. Seeing the figure, Reese's face twisted and contorted, first in shock and horror, then in rage. Before Reese had a chance to move, the figure brought the strange glowing tube down hard upon Reese's jaw, knocking him sprawling to the floor in a sea of swirling red lights and pulses. Andy froze on the spot. Where the hell is it? The figure said in a voice quivering with rage. Where is the cell? Reese lay still for a moment before his expression hardened in tough resolve. He sneered up at the stranger before leaning to one side and spitting on the deck plating. The stranger made no reply to the insult other than to place a heavy boot square upon Reese's chest, pushing him solidly to the ground. Andy watched the brief exchange from a position of abstract disbelief. The figure seemed lacking in any immediately distinguishing features, his upper body covered by a deep brown jacket with its collar turned up, obscuring the bottom half of his face. Of what Andy could see of the stranger, it was his eyes that made the biggest impression. Wide and penetrating, they were a deep hazel that glowed in the reflected light of the strange object. He was aiming down at Reese's head. Andy very slowly edged away from his position, moving subtly towards the corridor behind Reese and his assailant. The stranger took almost no notice of Andy, just another trace junkie. As he started moving, his wide eyes never leaving Reese's own, the pair content, for the time being at least, to stare each other down. As Andy slid towards his escape, he turned to look back at Reese, who was now sneering up at the stranger.